Well, everyone, welcome to our Supporting the Implementation Support Practitioner, Identifying and Mitigating Role-Related Challenges. My name is Sarah Verbeest, and I direct the Jordan Institute for Families here at the School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I have just feel very blessed and fortunate to get to work with the whole team that is bringing this webinar and this information to you today. And you'll see on this landing slide the logos of all of our partners that are here today. Next slide. So we have a lot of folks that have registered today. We had 1,200 people that were registered online. So I think we'll see that participant number continue to tick up. And so because of that, we are actually going to have you muted. So we've taken care of that for you, but we have made it possible for you to enable your video. So you can moderate how you want to be on video or not. But we do have you muted. We hope that you will use the chat to share questions and ideas with panelists and attendees and each other. In our past events, the chat has also been a really robust space of engagement, and you've done a great job at warming that up. So we hope that you will use that. We have folks that are going to be monitoring that chat, keeping an eye on it. Wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded, and that may influence also your choice of how you want to have your video. We will be posting this on our website and making it available. So yes, it will be available for you so you can relax into it and not worry too much about taking notes. And we will have a quick evaluation at the end, and we just ask that you please complete that because we really appreciate and value that feedback. So welcome. So what are we going to do with your the gift of your 2 hours? So the first part of our agenda today is talking about who is the implementation support practitioner. The second part, we're going to talk about what are some of the challenges that are faced by implementation support practitioners and how do they foster resilience in themselves and others. Then we're going to have an activity. And then our third part is how can implementation support practitioners foster resilience and mitigate burnout. And we'll have another activity to give you some actions to actually mitigate burnout. We will have a stretch break, and then we'll move into part 4, which is how can organizations and systems be better designed to support implementation support practitioners. We're going to offer you some examples from the field. We have a final activity around setting intentions and having a plan. And then we will wrap up and have Q&A as we have time, and we will close. So we've got a lot to cover, but hopefully a lot to really keep you engaged and paying attention. And again, we hope that you will give yourself the gift of this time to monotask and be together in this space with us. Next slide. So we also want to take this conversation global, which it already is. So if you are just hearing nuggets, quotes, information, ideas that you want to share, we would love it if you would use our, oh gosh, I'm going to say handle, hashtag, our social media item, which is hashtag UNC Practice 2022. And you can also follow us for more information about resources and events. But again, feel free to engage and share nuggets of wisdom, ideas, questions that come to you during our time together. Next slide. Okay, so in today's session, we are going to be doing interactive activities using the annotation function in Zoom to share ideas on the screen. So this was new for part of our team, and so we've been practicing, so we wanted to have you all have a chance to practice as well. But before we do that, you can see, oops, can we go back a little bit? I wanted to talk through the instructions in case this is new for you. So just so that you can go along with us, to annotate in Zoom, you need to go up and hover at the top of the screen to the menu, and you will see something that says View Options. So you see the green thing that says you are viewing Leah Bartley's screen. Hi, Leah. And then you will click on View Options. and a drop-down menu will, see, someone already figured that out. A drop-down menu is going to appear and you'll select annotate, and then you can choose the tool that you want to use. And it will appear. And if you had an oops and you annotated something you didn't want to, you just can click the erase or undo. So I love how we are I love how we are lighting up the screen. I think they could follow the directions. So we're going to go to the next slide and we're going to practice. So this also gives us a practice of clearing the screen. Awesome. Okay. So this is a chance for you to practice. So if you could annotate where you are joining us from in the world today, that would be exciting. Seeing someone is on an airplane, maybe over the ocean. We've got folks, wow, we've got some people that it is either very early or very late for you. It's so cool that you're with us. Exciting. We have one lone heart down in South America. Africa, wow, we're like definitely global. Welcome everyone. I love this. This is exciting. It's really cool, isn't it, that we can all be in this kind of shared space and connected across time zones. Some of you are even in a different day. And I think this kind of speaks to the universality of what we're talking about in our time and being together. So thank you all for warming up not only our chat, but our annotation function. And so just remember that skill, because we're going to have time for you to practice that later on. So with that, if we could go to one more slide, so we can, so setting the stage. So as we think about getting ready for a time together, we know that implementation support is both a science and an art. Implementation support is also the work of the head and the heart. We have all experienced over 2 years of change, loss, and growth. We've also seen rapid innovation out of necessity and have had to grapple as people and a nation with glaring disparities in racism. We've done a lot of work relating and learning via Zoom. And everyone is over capacity. This context signals an important moment in time for our field. Now is the opportunity to push toward new mindsets and ways of working, a time to support ourselves and each other and those we serve in different ways, and a time to really center equity as a priority. We hope that our time together today will offer insight, ideas, and support to you on your journey supporting and being implementation practitioners. And glad to see you all in the house. And I'm going to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Allison Metz.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It is so humbling to see that map on the screen and to see not only how many folks we have joining us, but the fact that we are kind of really have a pretty big reach this morning or this afternoon. So we're so deeply grateful for you to spend your time with us. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. So starting with myself, Sarah introduced me, Allison Metz. So I'm a professor of practice at the School of Social Work and the director of implementation practice for our school. And along with Sarah, we've been co-chairing these institute events since 2018, and they really fill us up. So I just want to note that getting to spend this time with you, whether in person or virtually, is one of the greatest gifts that we have in our role. I also really want to thank the Center for Implementation and co-sponsoring this Institute event with us today. It is just such an honor and a privilege to sponsor this event with TCI and the incredible work that they do. So just, again, so happy to be here. This is an incredible group of women that you're going to be hearing from today. So we have Julia Moore, the Executive Director for the Center for Implementation, and Sobia Khan, the Executive Director, and Sobia Khan, who's the Director of Implementation for the Center for Implementation. We also have Leah Bartley from our team here at the UNC School of Social Work, where she's a Senior Implementation Specialist. And we are so lucky to have repeat guests with us today. we have asked Kimberly Mann and Marita Brack to come back. They have both been speakers at previous events and were phenomenal. So we're so happy to have them come and share some case examples around their work as it relates to, mitigating burnout and fostering resilience in their implementation work. So Marita is the head of program for National Health Services Education for Scotland, and Kimberly Mann is the deputy director for research and child well-being at Illinois' Department of Child and Family Services. So please just welcome this incredible panel today. And hopefully we deliver on a really great journey for you. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Julia.
Wonderful. Thank you, Allison, and welcome everyone. We're so excited to see you and so excited to see so many names we know and people we don't know. Before Allison jumps into her first part, I want to make sure we set the stage and all get on the same page about what is an implementation support practitioner, because that's what we're going to talk about all day today. So a lot of us are implementation support practitioners, even if we don't have that job title, and maybe don't even realize that that's actually what we do. So one of the ways we like to help people understand their role in the system is to use the interactive systems framework. So next slide, to look at the different people in the system and see how you fit in. I like to start at the end on the far right-hand side, thinking about the beneficiaries. Who are the people that you hope benefit from whatever change initiative it is that you're doing? Say, maybe it's families or children or youth or patients or the public. And then you can think, who are the professionals often who are being asked to change their behavior in order to benefit some group? In order for those professionals, the recipients, to change their behavior, there's often a local implementation team that is supporting behavior change. But they do not work in isolation, and they are often connected back to people who have synthesized and translated research evidence, and very importantly, to a support system that might link together different people and support implementation, particularly when it's happening in multiple different settings or places at the same time. The implementation support practitioners often live in this support system. But the implementation support practitioner often doesn't have that job title, and they can look pretty different from each other. So slide. For example, sometimes you have implementation support practitioners that are in the support system, and sometimes they might work directly in that behavior change system. Sometimes they work at a policy level or a community level or an organizational level. Maybe they're working on tertiary, secondary, or primary prevention, for example. They can also provide support for multiple types of different initiatives, or they might focus exclusively on one specific initiative or program. Normally, the implementation support practitioner, or ideally, also have experience in the pathways of implementation. How can we actually support people to implement? And part of their role is about building capacity, coaching, and problem solving. It's pretty common for them also to develop and provide tools and resources, and sometimes to be engaged in some kind of quality assurance or maybe fidelity checks or implementation quality assessments to see how well implementation is going. So I think, especially seeing the names that are showing up, I think a lot of people in this call have the role of implementation support practitioner, even if that's not your job title. And so with that, everything we're going to talk about today is related to the role of the implementation support practitioner and how we can help them. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Allison and Leah.
Thanks so much, Julia. That was great. I love to hear us talk about who ISPs are and give ourselves an identity as we talk through this work together. So Leah Bartley and I are going to do a little tag teaming in this section. So this first section is looking at some of the challenges that implementation support practitioners face in their work and how those challenges might lead to burnout and thinking about the types of things that we might do to mitigate that burnout, as well as to mitigate the burnout of others, because that's a big part of our job. Is, not only do we have to think about our own burnout, but we really have to foster resilience in our implementation partners. And I just wanted to note that what we'll be presenting on the next several slides, it's really a totality of findings from some research we've been doing the last few years, some of which has been supported by the William T. Grant Foundation, where we've conducted interviews with implementation support practitioners, but we've also done a lot of work involving surveys and a systematic review that was led by Bianca Albers and others. And this work has really resulted in some findings that we've been able to identify related to burnout and resilience in this role. So we can go to the next slide. So before jumping into those findings, just wanted to tee up some ideas about burnout and resilience, specifically as it relates to our role in supporting implementation. We know that our ability to mitigate burnout doesn't happen in isolation, that our role is directly linked to the context that we work in. So where we're working, with whom we're working, as well as the systems that we seek to affect change in. So we know that we're not able to kind of foster resilience in isolation, that it's inextricably linked to the context and systems where we're working and we're supporting others in their work. We also know our ability to be resilient is highly tied to the relationships that we foster with ourselves in our work, but also how we foster relationships among the partners that we're working with as part of implementation projects. And we also know that issues around trust and power structures can either facilitate or hinder our ability to be resilient in implementation, and again, to support others in being resilient in implementation efforts. So you just want to kind of keep that in mind, that resilience is incredibly dynamic construct and many times is political in our work. And so we just kind of want to hold that as we move through kind of taking a look at these findings. Move to the next slide. So with that kind of stage setting in mind, one of the ways we approached kind of looking across the research that we've done the last few years is to look for themes. And we thought about that in the context of role theory. And what's really, helpful about role theory is it does acknowledge that the implementation support practitioner plays a specific role that Julia just talked about so beautifully. And again, that role is linked to the context within which we're working and those systems that we're seeking to support and affect change in. So if you think about this graphic on the page, each of these three areas is kind of complicated in itself. And these things all affect kind of burnout and our ability to mitigate that burnout. So for example, in our role, we're often playing multiple roles. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but I think most of us that play the role in ISP feel very stretched in our work and are called upon to do lots of different things in the name of implementation. We also need to use really different skills in our work. So one of the things that's incredibly clear in the role of the ISP and the interviews that we've conducted and the work that we've done and TCI has done and others around competencies is this work takes both technical skill, so helping folks use data for continuous improvement, but also relational skills, building teams, fostering relationships, facilitating. And then we also bring a set of values to our work. And those values actually are a key to helping us mitigate burnout. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Context, again, refers to where and with whom we work. So think about the teams that we form in our work. Teams is going to come up as a critical piece as we foster resilience, the relationships that we form, the implementation resources that are available to us or not available to us, and the organizational climate that we are working in. And so those issues around climate, for example, is it a learning culture in that organization? Those things can really impact our work. And then finally, those systems that we're supporting. Those service sectors come with a lot. So there's funding, there is legislation, there is policy. So there are these really bigger issues that are pushing down on us as we're attempting to do the work. And as those priorities and opportunities shift in those service sectors, we too have to be responsive in our implementation efforts. So we can move to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges we face around role, context, and system. And what we've learned from ISPs helps to mitigate that and to foster that resilience in others. So lots of challenges emerge in roles. So I'm just going to highlight 3 on this slide. One is our role does require a high level of expertise and experience. I foreshadowed that on the previous slide when I talked about the need to really be able to use both relational skills and technical skills to support the work and to address these various implementation challenges that arise. I am constantly surprised and heartened and inspired by how much ISPs bring to the work. You know, the ability again to be using data, but also having that really challenging conversation. And so ISPs really do require a lot of experience. We're often expected to fulfill multiple roles. So one example here is that sometimes we might be asked to fulfill a role that feels more in a monitoring capacity, so that we're really looking at fidelity data, we're kind of supporting what we might think of as performance coaching in the work, but then also we might be doing some really big problem solving and having those adaptive conversations with folks. So that's hard to kind of switch roles a lot in the work, and we're often asked to do that. And then finally, we've heard from folks that they can often feel isolated in their role. And part of that is sometimes we're not teamed up. That's really hard for folks who are working either as individual consultants in this role or an individual implementation facilitator, or even those who work in system, as Julie was describing, are often tasked with moving an implementation or a scale project through a process and don't feel like they're getting a lot of support. And one of the things we know is that often people don't seem to understand all it takes to support change, including our funders, and that can feel really isolating. Next slide. So people talked through what is it that really helps them create a sense of resilience in self. So in your specific role, what creates that self-resilience? So these are the things that we found in the research that we've done, is that being able to make a positive difference and contributing to outcomes is a really key thing for self-resilience. People mention that they always persevere when they believe that the work they're doing is having a positive impact. When their work they're doing aligns with their personal values. So you'll see there that second quote, that resilience for me is bound in values and beliefs. And so making sure that our values are aligned with the values of the partners that we're supporting. Having perspective. One of the quotes in the interviews actually said, the ability from experience to know this too shall pass. The idea that we're so used to implementation challenges that we can put them in perspective as we're moving through the work. Making room for creativity. In some ways, ISPs are some of the most creative people in terms of finding our way around those challenges. Connecting with other ISPs, so the meaningful relationships that we form with each other. And then finally, our ability to be flexible and adaptive, and as I always say, to stay curious. One of the biggest ways that we can feel resilient is to not get down, but to just keep staying curious about what the challenges are. So I'm going to hand it off to Leah to talk about context.
Thanks so much, Allison. So as Allison foreshadowed, context is really about those resources, relationships, and climate. And some of the common challenges that the group of ISPs that we talked to identified were issues related to power and motivation. So, whether there be buy-in for a potential new way of work, or whether there was a hierarchy within the organization, and those contextual features really influencing the degree to which people might be experiencing burnout. Also, in the work of supporting implementation and how some of that can kind of interface with how an implementation specialist might feel in terms of, is there limited absorptive capacity within the context? Meaning, is there limited availability to take a new way of work on, and how that contextual feature can really influence the degree of burnout? Is there an absence of learning culture? So is it more of a compliance-driven culture or climate within the organization, and very limited opportunities to think of new ways of work, or opportunities to improve in creative ways can really influence how the context might kind of influence burnout? And also, is there a lack of availability or openness to data to inform decision-making, and openness from diverse perspectives and data sources in making decisions? And so some of the things that we learned really mitigate some of those contextual challenges are really thinking about grounding the effort in long-term detailed implementation plans that are developed by a team. So using multiple perspectives to inform the development of an implementation plan. Encouraging psychological safety among team members and key stakeholders by really key, team development processes, and forming trust and strong relationships among team members. Both demonstrating active listening in terms of modeling that within teams, and fostering opportunities for team members to listen to each other can really mitigate some of those contextual features. Thinking about how teams can really celebrate small victories and share stories of success through communication pathways are really critical. And thinking about how ISPs can provide kind of anticipatory guidance, or normalizing some of the current contextual challenges folks may be experiencing as common through the implementation process. And also building and maximizing skills of others to lead implementation and innovation, and really thinking about distributing leadership. I'm going to turn it back to Allison here to talk through some of the system challenges.
Oh, thanks so much, Leah. So again, this last piece of this framework is the challenges that ISPs face within the systems that they're seeking to affect change in. So this is not going to come as any surprise to all the ISPs joining us today, but navigating the socio-political economic conditions that can divert attention away from implementation efforts. This comes up a lot, and in many ways can really make ISPs feel a bit helpless sometimes as they're moving the work forward. And so we're going to kind of talk through some ways to mitigate that. Feeling pressured by funders and partners to move forward before trusting relationships are built, or teams are prepared to work together. So the idea that we have to move at a pace that is quicker than trust, and that never works out, is a challenge that's faced. Understanding the complexity of the systems we work in, and that they're ever changing. And often, one of the things that we've noted quite a bit in our work recently is the absolute need to define values ahead of the implementation effort. So we bring a set of values to the work, but really talking with your partners, your funders, to understand the values that will lead the implementation effort. And that can really help mitigate some of these systemic challenges that we face. So let's move to the next slide and kind of think about that. You'll see there it says leading with values. And if we have a set of values, it can really help us make decisions, decide on investments, decide who to involve, how to share power. Those things are really critical when seeking kind of to support systemic change. So defining those values cannot be underestimated as I think an important way to foster a resilient system. Seeking opportunities to advance equity through equitable implementation strategies, I think, is directly linked to those values. Making the time to form those trusting relationships, to understand where the power structures are and to address those, to share in decision making, to respect community defined evidence. So there's lots of things we can be doing to foster a resilient system where the work is shared by those who are most affected by the implementation effort. Zooming out to see the big picture. So sometimes we are so, looking at those trees that we can't see the forest. And so that the ability to zoom out, defining failure as an opportunity. That is really important. Implementation does not happen without risk taking, and risk taking will involve some failure. So it is really important to kind of redefine that failure as part of implementation. Thinking about how system structures are set up that may hinder our implementation efforts. So really understanding those outer context variables. And then thinking about how we integrate advocacy into our work with funders and community partners. In the interviews we've done with ISPs, the question has been raised, are we advocates? I'd like to say that we are, because we can advocate for all of the things on this slide about values and about equity and about involvement of those most affected. We have an ability to do that. So Leah, I'll pass this back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. So we are going to do a fun activity using the annotation feature again to hear from you all. Where are you feeling resilient related to that role context system graphic? Where are you feeling resilient? Put a heart. And where are you feeling burnout? Put an X on the next slide here. If you remember, you should see at the top of your screen an option to annotate. You can click on that button there and start to add to this graphic. It should be, yes, here we go. So we're seeing lots of hearts around role, a lot of resiliency around role, and some mixed results there in terms of context. So interesting in terms of feeling resilient in your current context, or maybe some challenges. Many more burnout related to system. Wow.
Oh my gosh, Leah, unbelievable. So you guys are definitely burned out by the systems that you're working in. So this is an unbelievable visual, and you're finding hope in, I think, yourself and the people that you work with. Some of that context, those hearts I'm going to guess, are about your relationships. I'm going to take a wild guess that that's what those hearts are about. Leah, I'm thinking about time and thinking we're going to maybe let this go another 10 seconds or so and pass this off to Julia.
Okay. Great. Yes. Thank you all. Okay, let's turn it to Julia.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Allison and Leah, for setting the stage and giving us a really good sense of where people are feeling kind of strengths and some challenges right now. I have to share that I have been working on burnout as like a passion project for 3 years right now. And when Allison reached out and said, hey, we want to do this event, but it's on this sort of like related implementation, but kind of feels a little bit different topic of burnout, resilience, and implementation, I got so excited. Because right now we are hearing that burnout seems to be the #1 challenge at every level for implementation efforts. And we're seeing that and hearing that over and over and over again. And so I'm going to ground us a little bit in, okay, what is burnout? Because some of us have some misconceptions about what it is. And so how can we really all get on the same page and then set Sylvia up to talk about some of those system things that clearly people want to delve into. So slide. So what is burnout? Burnout is a work-related phenomenon. But burnout exists along 3 different spectrums. And that actually means that burnout looks different for different people. And what I love is that Allison just talked about the importance of values. And burnout is in fact all about whether your work and your days are aligned with your values. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more about that in a couple of moments, what that means. But what are some misconceptions we have about burnout? So slide. Some of the most common things we hear about all the time are people assume that burnout happens because people work too many hours or because their job is really stressful. Interestingly, working a lot of hours can increase the likelihood of burnout, just like working a stressful job can increase the likelihood of burnout. But those are not the direct causes of burnout. And those things alone and in isolation don't lead to burnout. And so understanding what many people then assume, if I work too many hours and take a break and work less hours, maybe my burnout will go away. Once you understand that that's not actually the underlying cause, you realize that that's not going to be an effective solution either. Another thing I think is so important to know is that burnout is something that happens to us. It's like a state or condition we can fall into, but it is not a personal quality that we have to carry around with us forever. We can experience burnout, we can stop experiencing burnout and kind of bounce back and forth between those. Slide. The other and probably most common question I have received about burnout over the past 3 years is burnout a personal issue? Like, are individual people responsible for fixing their burnout? Or is this a systemic issue and we have to fix the system in order to prevent and overcome burnout? The reality is that systems are set up sometimes to increase the likelihood of burnout. And if you saw that slide that everyone annotated, it sounds like many people in the audience today, many ISPs are working in systems that feel like they are set up to lead to burnout. But if we only focus at the system level, we ignore the fact that we as ISPs need to continue to function inside the system that already exists. And so what we really need is to come up with ways to create systemic change while also creating strategies at the individual level that we can use to address the burnout we might be experiencing literally right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some individual level things that you can do for yourself, for your teams, for people you're working with. And then Sylvia is going to jump into some examples at the system level before we have some great case studies to show you. So with that, let's jump into literally what is burnout? What are these different spectrums? So burnout exists along 3 different spectrums: the energy to exhaustion spectrum, the involvement to cynicism spectrum, and feeling productive to feeling unproductive. You might experience burnout on 1, 2, or all 3 spectrums, and that might change over time. And that's why everyone's experience of burnout can look quite different depending on where they're landing on across these spectrums. So as I explain each spectrum, so someone asked me to say it again. Gotcha, I'm going to go slide by slide describing each of these spectrums. But essentially, you can experience burnout that looks different from other people, and that's pretty normal. I'm going to go through each spectrum and do a little annotation activity so you can kind of self-rate yourself on where do you land across these spectrums. Also, Vanessa is going to post in the chat a link that has more information. We have a little handout with all these spectrums and kind of the things I'm going to cover, because I know lots of people say, oh, I want that information. So it's all sitting in that handout that Vanessa just posted. So next slide. So I'm going to go through an activity where I describe each spectrum and then get you to rate yourself along 3 aspects of that spectrum. So the first spectrum is the energy to exhaustion spectrum. This is what we typically think of when we hear burnout. It's that emotional element of burnout. This is where you're like, oh my gosh, I am so tired that I'm like drained before my day even starts. I like can't even get up. I don't even want to do anything else. Or I get home from work and I have no energy left for my kids, for my family, for my spouse, for my friends. This is what we really think of often when we think of burnout. It's the easiest to spot, but it's also one of the ones that's really easy to ignore. There are 5 questions that we can ask ourselves along the spectrum, but to kind of speed things up, we have an activity to get you to think through 3 of the different spectrums and see how you feel along this spectrum. So again, we'll annotate, so totally anonymous, but you can see how you and others are feeling along the energy to exhaustion spectrum. So slide. And so now you can pull up your annotation. Hold on, I'll be ready in just a second. There you go. Pull up your annotation, pull out a stamp. And for each of these three, where do you think you land? I'm not just tired, I'm drained. I feel overwhelmed or like I cannot keep up with my work. So I'll give people a moment. And number three, I don't feel I have enough energy for people or tasks outside of work. Fabulous. So really seeing this fill in. So it's interesting. I'm not just tired, I'm drained seems to have people across, although kind of more at the two different ends, really everywhere along the feeling overwhelmed spectrum, but it seems like a slight leaning towards being a little more overwhelmed. And again, a slight leaning towards feeling like people don't have enough energy for people or tasks outside of work. So mentally remember to yourself, where did I land generally across these three? Because this is the energy to exhaustion spectrum. So we could save that and I will clear it. The next spectrum we have is involvement to cynicism. When we feel involved, especially as ISPs, that's when we're like, ooh, I want to raise my hand. I'm ready to jump into this new project. Like, let's make this happen. When we land further towards the cynicism end of the spectrum, we start feeling disconnected, maybe from other people we work with, maybe disconnected from the work that we're doing. We start being more negative and pessimistic about whether things are going to work. This is the mental element. So the first element was emotional. This element is much more mental. And it's pretty common for other people to notice this aspect of burnout in you before you notice it in yourself. So kind of other people might see you kind of disconnecting and becoming more negative before you recognize that this is happening. So let's see where you land on this spectrum. So here I have three questions again. Number one, I feel detached from the work that I'm doing. So where would you land there? Number two, I find myself irritable with my colleagues, even if I don't show it. So maybe you're outwardly irritable or kind of keeping it in, but feeling irritable. And finally, I think or dream about leaving my job on a regular basis. So again, we see people really landing the complete spectrum. And that's because even if people are feeling burnt out, everyone's experience of this is going to be different. So personally, I land on the exhaustion end of the spectrum pretty easily, whereas I don't become cynical all that often, but I experience the third one, which we'll get to in a moment. So we'll save this and go into our third spectrum of burnout. So the last burnout spectrum is about feeling productive to feeling unproductive. And I want to emphasize the word feeling. It's not about how productive you actually are. It's about whether you feel productive. So this happens when you might work really, really hard and simultaneously feel like you're getting nothing done. This is the behavioral element of burnout. So first we had emotional, then we had mental, and this is the behavioral one. This is usually the hardest to recognize and understand because we often believe that those feelings of being unproductive are real rather than recognizing them as a sign of burnout. And I can share personally for me that absolutely happens, that I think that this is really, truly being unproductive as opposed to burnout showing itself this way. So what does that look like? So let's take a look at the three different examples of what this might look like for you. How would you answer, I feel unproductive even though I'm really busy? Next, I'm quick to question the value of the work that I do. And finally, I feel less appreciated at work than I have in the past. So again, seeing people really across the spectrum, this one seems to me to be maybe the strongest element of burnout at the moment, kind of based on these. But really seeing people every single place along that spectrum, because everyone's experience of burnout is a little bit different. So let's take a screenshot of that, and then I will clear it and have one little wrap up before I share a few tips and tricks that you can use to address burnout. So based on these three spectrums, where do you think you have the biggest strength? So which one is kind of your strongest spectrum? And which spectrum are you experiencing challenges? So you can put a heart if that's a strength, and you can put an X if you feel like that is a challenge for you. Oh, I should have realized hearts and X's are both red. Yeah, so it looks like lots of X's on energy to exhaustion, although some hearts, a few more hearts on involvement to cynicism, and a big mix on efficacy to inefficacy. And I like people's hearts written on top. That is fabulous. So I'm going to clear this and wrap this up and leave you with a couple of different strategies that you can use to address burnout. First, you need to understand, so why does burnout happen? We talked before, Allison mentioned values and I mentioned it before. And ultimately, burnout happens when your days and your work feel disconnected from your underlying values. That can be at a high level, meaning the work I do doesn't deeply align with my values, is likely to lead to burnout. But it can also be at a micro level. So I'm going to give a personal example. I get energized when I spend my days doing big picture brainstorming and thinking, answering really hard questions. But recently, I've been doing a lot more administrative stuff for a variety of different reasons. And that actually leads me to feel a little more burnt out, even when I love my job and deeply love what I do and it aligns with my overarching values. But suddenly my days feel disconnected from the things that energize me and the things I value most. And so we want our days and our work more broadly to align with our values in order to prevent and overcome burnout. And when Allison talks about the importance of placing values at the center of implementation work for the ISP and for the implementation initiative, that's what it allows you to do, is center everyone's work around these values. So imagine you take this away and think, oh my goodness, I am experiencing burnout along one of these spectrums. You might want information about what do you literally do. So I will share 3 quick strategies, one for each spectrum, because ultimately the same strategies won't work for everyone because they need to be matched to the kind of burnout you are experiencing. And I want to note, I actually have an extra 3 strategies in that handout that Vanessa posted. So I have a few more examples of things you could do, but I wanted to make sure you left with some things. So if you are experiencing burnout along the energy to exhaustion spectrum, what's one thing you could literally do today after this call? I would make a personal energy to exhaustion map. Literally map out your day, look at your day, and think, each activity I did this energize me? Maybe give that a number like +1. Was it kind of neutral? Or did it drain you? You can't go through a whole day and only do energizing activities. That's not the goal, but it can help you look and see how are you spending your days and where could you amp up and spend more time doing things that energize you? And are there ways to change the things that are really depleting your energy? And ask yourself questions like, is this really worth the energy investment I am putting into this activity? Sometimes you have the control over changing those things immediately, and sometimes it's a longer game that you have to figure out over time. If you feel like you are struggling along the involvement to cynicism spectrum, slide, then my colleague Elizabeth, next slide, please. My colleague Elizabeth has this great activity that she came up with. So she's my burnout partner and she is a therapist. And so this is her absolute favorite activity for people who struggle with cynicism. You open a document, a blank document, and you switch the font to any symbol, like one of those Wingdings or like any of those crazy symbol fonts that's not real letters. And you just type and you let it all out. No censoring, don't hold back. You can say swear words, whatever needs to come out comes out on that page. When you finally feel like you have let it all out, switch the font and read it. Or even better yet, literally just delete it because you've gotten it out from inside of you. The very final spectrum is thinking about feeling productive to feeling unproductive. So as I mentioned, this is one I really struggle with. And so one of the things that happens if you experience burnout on this spectrum is it's easy to get into the anxiety spiral of like, oh my goodness, what if this bad thing happens? Or what if this thing that I want to happen doesn't happen? And all of a sudden we can spiral out into kind of these catastrophic thinking patterns. But instead of thinking, what if? Can you change the words to even if? Even if this thing that we don't want to happen happens, how are we resilient? How will we be able to persevere and still move forward? Even if I don't get this thing that I really want, what can I actually do to continue to get towards my end goals? How can we move these implementation efforts forward? How can I build these relationships? Because even if things happen that are challenging and difficult, we can often persevere and find other ways to get there. And so this really can help us shift from this kind of more catastrophic thinking to a much more resilient mindset by literally changing 2 words. So hopefully those gave you a few ideas of things that you can do if you are experiencing burnout along any of those different spectrums.
Hope you enjoyed your break. I imagine some of you are still coming back. That felt like a really short 5 minutes. And hopefully you had a chance to recharge. We've had a great first hour, and I hope that you have learned a lot. I'm seeing in the chat, there are tons and tons of comments about how much they've appreciated the information that was delivered by Allison and Leah and Julia. And so in the second half, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about systems and talk about what we can do in systems. And so this is like imagining what a system could look like and what we could do to really support implementation support practitioners from the system perspective. And then we're going to hear from some great speakers about some of their own real life experiences in this topic, becoming implementation support practitioners and how they support practitioners as well as how they're supported. And so what I'm going to talk about right now over the next 15 minutes is that system perspective. Next slide, please. So we heard earlier from the speakers about how the ISP can really feel system pressures from different directions. So for example, you feel the pressure of working within a complex system. And then you also feel the pressure of being subjected to systemic dysfunction, which is what leads to burnout. And I'm going to try to talk at a very high level about each of those things. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about working within a complex system, this happens to be one of my specialties. I love thinking about complexity, but I know that a lot of people don't. And that's a source of pressure for a lot of people. So next slide. So I'm not going to go through this in great detail. This is essentially what Allison and Leah had talked about earlier. Just a reminder is up on the screen about the different factors that ISPs face in their job that can make it more difficult. All of these things about navigating complexity and working within systems that make it really difficult to be able to fulfill your role and to do your job. So how can organizations and systems prepare ISPs to work in these kinds of settings? Next slide. So the first thing, remember, we're reimagining a system. So the first thing that we can do is change our mental models about how we think implementation work happens. So implementation is a social process. It's a relational process. We have to build networks amongst team members across organizations to even be able to do the work in the first place, to complete those implementation tasks and activities. And it's that combination of things that leads to outcomes. But because we can't measure relationships and because relationships aren't a technical task, it feels like our funders and our policymakers don't really value those things and expect us to only report on those last two things, which is why we prioritize them. But if we shift our mental model to see building networks and relationship building as part of an implementation process, then we can start valuing it in a different way. So next slide. One way that we can signal a shift in mental models is to actually explicitly draw out relationships in our implementation pathways. So what you see on the left-hand side of the screen is a pathway that we've developed at TCI called the strategies pathway. And it goes from exploring the thing to selecting change strategies. And you'll notice at the bottom, we've explicitly drawn out relational dynamics. When you name it and people see it, then they see it as part of the process, and it shifts their mental model towards thinking about that thing and how it factors into a process. And we've also drawn out a relational pathway specifically for building teams so that when people are thinking about implementation, they're thinking about relationships. And so that we can actually try to shift mental models so people prioritize that. And that can get seeded up to, like when we're talking to policymakers, for example, or funders, it gets seeded up to that level and people can pay attention to this process. Next slide. Another thing that we can do is develop a workforce that thinks about complexity. And this is not just the job of the ISP. It's not that just ISPs have to understand complexity. It should be everybody in the system who is working towards implementation. So policymakers, funders, frontline implementers, leaders, et cetera. We have to know how to deal with complexity in the system so that we can advocate for change and that we can deal with that uncertainty. And so some of those competencies for complexity that should be embedded in workforce development are up on the screen. Things like understanding characteristics of a complex system, being comfortable with uncertainty, and understanding those windows of opportunity and how to create pockets of action for when things feel like they're kind of slowing down and when we need to pounce on them. So those are things that people need to learn in order to move forward in a system. Next slide, please. From a system level too, we have to embrace a culture shift that embraces complexity. So here we're building organizations and systems that actually consider and respond to how implementation happens in real life. I do not have time to go through this model that is on the screen in detail, but I love, love, love this model. It's called the complexity leadership model, and it's actually from the business literature. So these people have worked with organizations like Facebook and Google to really understand how innovation happens and how we can be agile in the face of all this dynamic context. And so the idea here is that organizations and systems are inherently hierarchical because that's the way we've built them to be. And also that we expect certain things to happen. Like, for example, we have these timelines where you have to have XYZ deliverable in this time frame. But we know that implementation doesn't happen that way because things change and we might need to, pivot and things don't go according to plan. And so here, the idea is that we're creating a strategy that is operational and that there are other people who are working within the system who are doing the implementation and doing the iterating, who are able to seed that their lessons learned and some of that agility up into the operational part through something called an adaptive space. And it's this focus on interaction between the people who are developing the strategy and the people who are actually implementing that can help strategy to become more realistic and to be more dynamic and flexible to real world conditions. So again, I encourage you to read this in order to be able to understand how systems can be designed differently to actually address the real world conditions of implementation. Next slide, please. So those are some of the things that we can do to talk about system complexity and the pressures related to system complexity. But what about the pressures of being subjected to systemic dysfunction? Next slide. This is where we start talking about burnout. And I know Julia talked a lot about burnout and the things that we can do at the individual level. But there are also, she also made reference to the bigger systemic factors that do contribute to burnout. So what can we do at this level? I think the first thing to do is to understand burnout and the different factors that relate to burnout from this big system perspective. And so burnout is created by a confluence of factors. So there's a constellation of factors at the work level, a constellation of factors at the life level, and a constellation of factors at the system level that interact within those categories and then across those categories to create burnout. So let's go through an example of what this might look like. Next slide, please. Imagine there's a social worker who joins a community organization as an implementation support lead. And this person starts this job and realizes that in this organization, there's a toxic workplace, that she has an unsupportive manager, that she is the only woman of color and so has been asked to take on DEI work outside of her role to lead this DEI committee. So she's feeling all these factors within the work that's kind of making her starting to feel burnt out. And then, next slide, please. She has other things going on in her life. For example, she's married, but is having some difficulty in her marriage. She has some personal expectations that's creating some unrealistic expectations of her role as a wife and as a daughter, et cetera, in her life. And so she's feeling these other factors in her life that are also contributing to this idea of burnout. Next slide, please. Then on top of that, there's some expectations that she has based on her gender and her race that have been placed by the system, and that she also feels at the individual level. And then there's a stigma related to talking about how she's feeling in her mental health. And so that's also contributing to her burnout. Next slide. Now we see how complex things can get because we see that there are dependencies between all these things. Like that stigma relates to things happening at work and things happening in life. That those expectations she feels at system level also deal with things that are happening in her life and also how she feels at work. So again, it's not just one thing that's happening at work, it's a constellation of factors that are really connected to one another that help people or that lead people to this idea that they're feeling burnt out. So the point is showing that this system of factors happens, and that if we can identify a system of factors, we can identify where there might be levers for change to be able to mitigate the situation. Next slide, please. I also want to mention very quickly the idea of burnout, resilience, and equity. And I wanted to say this because, I'm a woman of color, I'm the child of immigrants. And so when I think about burnout, I think about how I might experience burnout differently than other people might experience burnout. So I think it's expecting people to manage burnout and be resilient might be particularly problematic for certain kinds of people. So for example, people might not communicate burnout in the same way or not be able to communicate burnout. Some people might face stigma when they do show signs of burnout. So for example, feeling withdrawn or irritated could feed into racial stereotypes. And also sometimes when we talk about being resilient, it also hides the trauma of marginalization, because there's some communities that are always asked to be resilient because of the historical trauma they face. And so really for some people, we need to fix the systemic issue in order to be able to address their burnout and to be able to increase their resilience. So systemic change can particularly benefit historically marginalized people. And we can recognize that different people will need different supports, and that we should figure out how, as a system, we can support people with different needs. Next slide, please. So what are some upstream solutions to burnout? So I've talked a lot about how you can kind of diagnose these different, the system factors and the dependencies, and we talked a bit about equity. So what can we do as solutions to burnout from a system perspective? Well, the first thing is to build compassionate and connected spaces. And so this is where we can network with one another to be able to alleviate some of the stigma that we face around talking about burnout. So I noticed in the chat, some people have been talking about how they really resonated with the point that Allison was presenting on, which is feeling isolated in their role. And we hear this all the time at TCI, that ISPs are feeling isolated in their role. And the idea here is to connect with one another in a space where there's not just empathy, but people aren't just saying, I hear you, but compassion, where they're saying, I feel you. So for example, if you look at the impact of Twitter on professionals, the fact that people can say something on Twitter that they have the courage to speak out about, and all of a sudden thousands of other people might say, oh my gosh, I feel the exact same way. I didn't know there are other people like me. And it creates a space where people who otherwise wouldn't be able to talk about this are now able to talk about it and can dispel stigma. So to create a space like the way we do on Twitter, but for ISPs, we've been trying to do that with something we call the implementing change community at TCI, where we have ISPs who we've brought together as a network to talk about their work initially, but some people have jokingly said it feels a bit like implementation therapy now, because we get to talk about how we're feeling in this role. And so it's that connection piece that can really help people dispel that stigma. Next slide, please. I'm not going to say too much about this because Allison has already talked about this, but just saying again that values are so important to what we do. And it's also the dissonance between values and actions that creates this mistrust and can lead to things like burnout. So in this situation, as a system, what we need to do is to be able to create values-based organizations and systems, to have people actually substantiate their actions with the values that they bring to the table, because that also sets up systems of accountability. If we know what motivates people to do something and they're not doing that thing, then we're able to speak out and say, hey, this is not what you said you're going to do. And so setting up systems of accountability can help us set up that trust in the system. Finally, next point, it's helpful to set up ISPs in ways to work in fair and just ways. And so I don't know if you have read this, and I encourage you to read this document or this book called Dismantling Racism. And this link I have on the slide is a handout that describes 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture. I have it up here because so many of us are subject to white supremacy culture in our workplace and don't even know it. And when I read this, I was like, ooh, this is really eye-opening. So this culture is the basis of capitalism. It's perpetuated by colonialism. And I'm not going to go through this in detail because of time, and I see I'm running out of time, but it helps to be reflective about things like perfectionism in the workplace, the sense of urgency we have, the idea that we have quantity over quality, that we worship the written word. Where do these ideas even come from? And why do we think that this is the right way to work? And is this a fair way to work? I'm bringing this up because we have to question our work models and whether certain models are a right fit for the role and whether the work models are just and fair in the first place. So true systems change means moving away from models of work that don't align with our role. So why do we do a 9 to 5? Why do we have a 5-day work week? Why do we feel like we need to micromanage people and monitor people if we trust them in their work? Why do we have time-based outputs versus quality-based outputs? And why do we feel like in order to be productive, we have to be chained to a desk or a computer? Those are things that value capitalism at the expense of people's well-being. And so really, really questioning why systems are set up the way they are and changing them to be more productive for us and for our well-being is something we should be working towards. With that, I'm actually going to skip the next 2 slides just because I'd like to give more time to our speakers. So I'm going to hand it off to Kimberly.
Wow, is all I can say, Sylvia. You've just named so many things that we feel in the work on the ground of doing implementation. Thank you all so much. This has been so affirming for me too, as I'm resonating with so many of the comments in the chat. I am representing the state of Illinois. I'm a social worker working with the Department of Children and Family Services, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our efforts over the past few years around implementation, some of the bruises that we've gotten over the years, and some of the successes as well. Next slide. Our child welfare system is state administered. About 80% of the cases that are seen within our state are supported by our community-based organizations, with the remaining being by the state child welfare providers. And for me, coming into this work, I had done a lot of different things. I had done some teaching of social work over the years, but really from my own time back in getting trained in social work, I believe sort of there should be a soundtrack for everything. And my theme song has been Taking It to the Streets. And I remember back when I was in MSW school, trying to really figure out whether or not certain kinds of things were going to be helpful to me. I always felt like the beneficiary at the end, I always call it, what's happening in the living room was the most important thing. And so that's been a guide for me. And so I think I've been set up to work around implementation really since the beginning of my career. I was probably typically one of those early adopters of the work and trying to find ways to apply knowledge and to solutions to wicked problems that we were often facing. And if we fast forward to when I came on board with our child welfare system, we formally began to call some of these efforts of making the knowledge fit in the living room for families implementation efforts, probably with our federal waiver, which was known as IB3, our 4E waiver that operated between 2013 and 2019. About just under 3,000 children were served in that period. And it was the beginning of implementing really some more developmentally informed assessments, but also some evidence-based interventions. And that was really the start of hiring people who had job titles that were called implementation specialists. In 2016, while I wasn't working with the program at that time, there was another program that was about implementing system change and looking at supporting quality practice. And that was our immersion site program, which operated in 4 regions of the state. Through the work we do with NERN, we began to implement implementation teams with that program. And there are 62 of those teams operating in the state that we support, really for quality practice change. So we're going to be talking a little bit about evidence-based interventions and changing of practice. We also have a baby court or early childhood court team. And we've served about 85 children total with that project in Cook County, which is where the city of Chicago is located. And that is an interesting implementation effort because it allows someone who is targeted to change to really live in the life of a case from case opening to case closure. And we're really excited by our data around engagement in that project. And finally, like many folks in the United States, at least, we're working with our Family First Prevention Services Act. And we have we've moved from just 2 little evidence-based interventions in the previous waiver to now 8. So nothing like going big, right? And trying to really support a lot of change. I'm going to talk about the challenges of that. 4 of my implementation specialists are working with the broader mental health parenting supports, and another 4 are a group of folks that work out of our early childhood program, which is the collaboration with Erickson Institute. And those implementation specialists also have backgrounds in infant mental health. So to date, we've served about 1,242 kids since October of 2020 in the general EBIs. And then For home visiting, another 1,067 infants and toddlers have been identified for that intervention. So that's a little bit of our context for the work that we've been doing. Next slide, please. I want to say that the context around all of that work means that we have, state level support. We have, and I mean state level support to the level of the governor's office. We have the federal support of having waivers, but we also have in there a mix of things like consent decrees. And so the context can be challenging. And some of the lessons that we have taken from this is just how hard it can be to maintain your focus on the change that you're trying to create in the midst of what we call the whirlwind. And it's just very, very easy to kind of lean into the busyness of the work in the course of this relationship-based practice that we've been talking about, to let that relationship literally pull you into the whirlwind. And literally, as for those of us who are trying to ground the implementation efforts, we're constantly trying to maintain disciplined focus and attention, because it takes more than a minute. It's not a 3-day training, right? The other focus that we've really struggled around is fidelity, because it's very easy, again, to have the model that started off as the ABC model become the ABCDE model, because we're suddenly doing something very differently if we're not maintaining that disciplined attention. Often success is kind of interesting, because there you can get the what I call the mission creep. And administration can see this as the next shiny thing. And so there's do more of it, do it faster, we want it for everybody, those kind of things that can happen. So staying focused on the change that you're trying to create for the time that it takes, which is not something that is always understood by everyone within the system. For us, our target for change has typically been supervisors. And we more recently have begun to think about that beyond the individual supervisor to supervisors and their teams, and that they are leading that change for their teams. We've talked a little bit about psychological safety and a learning culture. And this is really hard in child welfare, where you can have folks looking literally even at the level of the media at mistakes that can be made. And so creating that safety to say this is hard is not always an easy thing to do. Next slide, please. In child welfare, and probably a lot of places that are taking on using evidence-based interventions, we have what I love to call the alphabet soup, which is why you see that spoon there. I talked about the sheer number of evidence-based interventions that we are using, but when you're trying to remember NPP from triple P and CPP, just those three, there's a lot of P's, right? And so it's really hard for a very busy professional to remember that there is a model that's going to help a parent or a child with a very specific thing. So this is a big change in what we call the services, going to services. Just we're going to refer you out for services, thinking more broadly about counseling or generically about mental health or substance abuse disorders. So you literally are trying to now match someone who's got problems with behavior, a specific challenge with externalizing behavior, or a trauma issue. And so having professionals, child welfare professionals, think about those things in new ways has been a substantial change effort, and we are very much still in the process of that one. We've had to create some IT to support that even, and some tools beyond the typical handouts and trainings, and even the work that the implementation staff themselves do by going out and constantly reinforcing that work. But we actually built decision support to help people with assessments, and a new portal to help them with those referrals that they're making to these very specific interventions. Next slide, please. So in order to do this work, the professional, the end user of the models, is going to need a knowledge of the different models to know what they're good for, what age groups. We don't want 18-year-olds going to child parent psychotherapy because it's designated for kids between the ages of birth and 5. I'm actually waiting for that one to happen someday. We've got to really deal with this issue of what I call triaging. Evidence-based interventions, by definition, are good at a very defined set of things. It's a piece of the pie, as I call it. And usually families don't come with just that one need. And it's really challenging for professionals to think about, where should we start? How is this particular change, this particular intervention going to be helpful to the family? And should I do this one first or should I do that one first? Those are really difficult things. And they require this ongoing implementation support, sometimes for that problem solving. It also requires care coordination to think about bringing people together, sometimes to collectively think about making those hard decisions. And clearly there has to be resources for the family. We don't want to do the let's try to have everybody do it all at one time. That's, we think about equity issues and families that are very oppressed by a lot of things, asking them to do 20 things at once is probably not going to be successful, like it's not going to be successful for any one of us. That's where we get compliance and a lot of resistance. Next slide, please. We've talked so much about the things that get messy in this work, and my colleagues have done such a beautiful job articulating it. I want to just hit on a couple of those. The change process, by definition, is trying to change something in the status quo. And that's not that is frowned upon in what I call bureaucracy school. It plays itself out in so many ways. Systems don't like to change. And so, but we sometimes forget that it's not the person who's saying no, it is the system that is literally pushing back against the change. But naming a problem can be very, very challenging when we're talking about young professionals, where this is very relationship-based work and they're having to go against people who they may hold in high esteem, or even be afraid of, or have as people who are in roles that are over them. So there's a discomfort and relationship threat to being the voice of maybe not, maybe it shouldn't be done that way because we've always done it that way. The other issue in bureaucracies, at least, and where there's hierarchies, is this issue of authority, but I'm going to add an element to that and add what I call street credibility. Because when you're coming in often, as this person who's defined with a role of implementation support, the question from the folks in the field is going to be, do you know anything about the work that I'm doing? Have you ever done this particular work? And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes people are doing this particular implementation work because they know a lot about evidence-based models, and they may know a lot about trauma. And so it is a process, very much a parallel process to engaging with families, to get in there with an agency and with a team to become that support person, to support problem solving for them. The other thing is that these problems, as people have been brilliantly talking about throughout the morning, are not necessarily easy to solve, because underneath them can be things like culture, which make them adaptive problems, and they're not going to be solved by going to a training or a 3-hour meeting. And now all of a sudden we go back and do everything differently. That's just not how it works. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I've been talking with my team about as we talk about supporting the implementation practitioner is to think about, again, not personalizing, when the system pushes back. We were talking about this in a debrief after a meeting, and a particular colleague from another area had talked about, well, this is how we're structured. We can't do this, we can't do that, in so many words. And we bring in that system framework to think about how culture and how our mental models are really framing, I can only see the world this way, and I can't envision a new way that it could happen. So we literally have to start with people where they are, as we always say in social work, and begin to guide them from that place to experiencing, possibly trying out, different approaches. The other piece that we have as a challenge is that even though we have staff dedicated to doing implementation support, they're working in a context which we see really across the nation in fields even beyond child welfare, of attrition, staffing challenges. And so they may be literally standing at the door knocking, but people say, we have no time for this. So helping them to persevere and finding ways, finding supports, finding allies to help them with their engagement efforts is a critical piece of what's needed. The other piece, and I struggle with this one myself, because the mountains, as we see, can be very, very hard to climb. And Julia talked about our feelings of being productive versus unproductive. And just the volume of the problems that are ahead of you can make you, not pause and reflect on the challenges that you've already conquered. And that one I have to really work on for myself as well. There are many, many mountains to climb in this work, but we really have to stop, pause, reflect, and celebrate those small successes. If our data is shifting by a tiny percentage, we really want to take note of that. When we hear new people speaking the words of change, the process of change, we want to stop and celebrate that. Next slide, please. Those who work with me know I'm a big believer in naming it, and this has been talked about as well. In our work in our system, we have a set of what we call core concepts, and we find that we really want to be able to help professionals to name the activities that they're doing and deal with this issue in the world of reflective practice. Donald Schoen taught us many, many years ago that we often say we believe in something, but we don't necessarily recognize that there's a gap between that espoused thing that we say we believe in and how we're actually behaving. And so we, in our work, do try through the concept of naming it, and not only naming it, often showing data related to it. And that's where our continuous quality improvement comes into our implementation work, and help people to see the gap between this thing that we say is important. Like if we say care coordination is important, very few people who work with complex families would say that's unimportant. But are we actually sitting at the table, having the meeting where we're doing care coordination? We have data on that. And so that's something that we want to bring together so that our beliefs and our data and our activities all begin to come together in a way that helps us to, live the values and the practices that we say are so important. Naming it for me is also important, just like this day has been for so many of us. And it normalizes the challenges, and it gives us meaning for the struggles that we're all in together. And then we can apply our learning from one situation to another, or at least critically think about where it fits and where it doesn't. So for me, all of those things have been important in our support for our practitioners and for me professionally in the work that we're doing. My last slide. Thank you so much. We haven't specifically talked about it, although I think we've alluded to it. And while this is also relational, we believe highly in doing reflective supervision, reflective support, allowing our professionals. My colleague talked about all the things that people may have going on in their lives as they yet come in and struggle to do this work. In our support, as we do for families, we are guiding people through the change process, guiding them through the engagement process, persevering, because sometimes we don't have very realistic, and that's where our beliefs and expectations. Professionals can think, they were supposed to try and go out and maybe they initially thought they would be embraced, or they thought things would change within 3 months, and understanding that it takes time. That's a really critical challenge so that we pull together and support. Finally, we've talked so much about blending our beliefs and our values. I think it's important for people to see the change, and that's where bringing the lived experiences of families to the work can be so life-changing for us. When we get a little bit distant from the work, we can wonder if it matters. And hearing families tell their own testimonials and getting to see the change builds that heart muscle for doing this implementation work. We have to understand this parallel process and keep, talking about the challenges that not only we're facing in the implementation world, but how that relates to the professionals that we're dealing with and that the families are dealing with. And finally, taking time to reflect on those values. One of my favorite professional values is trying to be non-judgmental, knowing that's very, very difficult. And yet knowing that families in child welfare also often tell us that that's the number one thing they're challenged by with us. So how do we bring all of these things together and help our professionals find in that that supportive, reflective space, my last song, A Safe Place to Land. I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Marita.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you for having me here today. I'm delighted to be here to share with you all about how we're supporting the implementation support practitioner through our work here in Scotland. And today I want to focus on one of our major strands of work that we've been implementing since 2013, which is the Psychology of Parenting Project, or POP for short, which is a Scotland-wide implementation of evidence-based interventions to support parents of children who have high levels of difficulty in terms of their emotional, social and behavioural development. And NHS Education for Scotland is a national health board here in Scotland, and my team, which is comprised of clinical psychologists, we work in partnership with local communities across the country in their work supporting children's mental health and well-being. And within the work that we do in relation to POP, we support implementation at 2 levels within the service system. So as insiders who've been tasked by the Scottish Government with implementing the project at a national level, and also as outsiders who support the implementation work that's happening at the local level. And like so many others, both my team and the implementation support practitioners that we support in local communities have faced enormous challenges over the past few years due to the pandemic. So these will be things that you're familiar with. So, you know, having to shift to virtual and online delivery of services, having to rapidly develop new skills and new ways of working, the major shifts in priorities and areas of focus and new work plans being developed, and lots of uncertainty and change across all levels of the system. And for our colleagues working on the ground, you know, there was lots of staff changes where staff were redeployed elsewhere, sometimes not returning to the services that they'd worked in before, the delivery of services being stopped and redirected, and having to really be creative about how they could support families in different ways because the business as usual services were not able to operate. So under those circumstances, it's been really crucial to foster resilience and mitigate against burnout, both within our own team, but also supporting the incredible implementation support practitioners that we work with, many of whom were not feeling sufficiently supported within their own organisations during this time, where public and voluntary services were being put under incredible pressure. It was interesting to hear Julia speak about the sort of roles and what defining what is an implementation support practitioner. And for the majority of the practitioners that we work with, their role as implementation leads for the delivery of POP in their community is really just an add-on to their real jobs and just a small part of their day-to-day work. And this can really create a sense of isolation in their role, as there's often very little focus or acknowledgement of their implementation work at the local level, and it's not, you know, seen as a priority within their local services. And there's just a general lack of awareness and appreciation about what their role involves, and, you know, the amount of effort that's involved to make change, which we've talked about, and just how sophisticated the work is in order to effectively implement change within services. So supporting implementation support practitioners and helping to reduce this isolation is a critical part of what my team does. So for a long time, the relational aspect of implementation work has really resonated with our team, and the importance of this has been magnified by the pressures that the practitioners and services have been under for the past 2 years. Part of our interest in the importance of relationships has been informed not just by our experience of implementation, our understanding of implementation practice, but it's also because of our professional backgrounds as clinical psychologists, and really seeing a strong alignment between our clinical skills and those needed as an implementation support practitioner. And today what I want to share with you is how we've been taking a relational approach to supporting our work with implementation support practitioners, but also helping implementation support practitioners to support each other, and how we've drawn upon some of our clinical skills that I've listed here on this slide to inform this work. Part of the support that the team has always offered to practitioners has been technical, logistical and practical support, and that certainly remained the case during COVID. For example, we'd be adapting resources, developing new materials, updating implementation guidance and supporting access to remote delivery workshops. And we tried to do this in a really responsive and timely fashion so that the ISPs knew that they were able to continue to rely on us to provide the sort of support that we'd always offered, despite the change in circumstances. However, alongside this, over the past 2 years, we've really placed even greater emphasis on maintaining and strengthening our relationship with the practitioners, and also prioritising helping the implementation practitioners who work in different organisations across different parts of the country and who tend to only meet together when we put on an event. We really wanted them to be able to build connections with each other, and to see that as a way to help create their self-resilience, but also to reduce the isolation that so many of them were reporting feeling. And one of the ways that we did this was through creating more frequent, engaging and meaningful opportunities for the ISPs to connect both with our team and with each other. And although COVID has presented many challenges and barriers, one of the benefits that did come out of the pandemic was the move toward remote and digital working. And this was an opportunity to remove the barriers that we'd faced previously, presented by geography and needing to physically travel to meetings where we could have all of the ISPs together. And so online meetings increased people's availability to attend, as they didn't need to allow time for travel. It meant that they could fit meetings into other parts of their day. And it also allowed us to have more frequent but briefer meetings, as we didn't feel the need to sort of justify bringing everyone together by having a whole day event, so we could have shorter, more focused times together. And we took a really collaborative and responsive approach to decisions around the agenda items and the topics to discuss, the frequency and the format of the meetings, and use this as an opportunity to empower the implementation colleagues to take greater ownership of the meetings, such that they would be leading the discussions rather than us, that they would have the opportunity to showcase their work and share the approaches that they were trying locally within their own areas. And particularly during the early days of the pandemic, a great part of our focus was really on actively listening to the implementation practitioners in order to understand and acknowledge and validate what was going on in their own unique context, and to understand fully the sorts of challenges and changes and difficulties that they're experiencing. And allowing us to have opportunity to empathise with them and actively demonstrate that we were still here to support them despite the change in circumstances. But through that active listening, what it really also allowed us the opportunity was to highlight the strengths and notice and draw out the victories that they were having. Often it didn't feel to them like they were having many successes, but we were able to notice these and really celebrate those successes for the successes that they were. And really crucially, it was an opportunity for the implementation practitioners to do the same to each other. So they were genuinely interested in understanding what other issues the different areas across Scotland were facing, and to learn from colleagues. And they sincerely cared about the issues that they were facing, because they were doing the same work, and they had the shared values and the shared ambitions that they would be having meaningful impact for the children and families that they were supporting. So this was a real opportunity to break down the isolation and to build that network and that sense of belonging to each other. And one of the other things that was really important was that we used the opportunity to share data to be able to show the implementation practitioners the evidence of the impact of the work that they were doing and what it was having on the families that they were supporting. And that was really important to powerfully demonstrate that impact, but also to validate their efforts and reinforce to them why their work was important, which was not necessarily something that they were getting a lot of feedback or attention about within their local systems. Understandably, there are often strong emotions in the meetings that we would have with our ISP colleagues, and there were times where the implementation practitioners were experiencing stress or disappointment, anxiety, or generally feeling overwhelmed and sometimes unsupported within their own organisations. However, this allowed us an opportunity to really recognise and validate and normalise their experiences, but also managing the emotional content of the discussions and create a place of psychological safety. And one of the unexpected consequences of COVID was because it had impacted on everything so dramatically and disrupted even the most routine of services. It really created an environment where expectations had to be totally readjusted. And through our relationship-focused approach to our work, this allowed for much greater openness and transparency about the reality of the service delivery. And what we found was once the pressure of having any focus on achievement and evaluation had been removed, as well as creating a space of mutual support, it also really opened up opportunity for creativity, for new ways of working, for joint problem solving, and really an authentically collaborative approach to implementation planning and delivery, which had not been as strong prior to the pandemic. As well as being able to recognise the clinical skills that our team were applying to their implementation work, what we were also able to see was how the implementation practitioners were taking a similar approach to how they supported each other, but also how they were supporting their practitioners on the ground who were delivering the frontline services. We've heard so much about what's involved in the work today, and it really highlighted to me the incredible levels of technical and relational expertise that there was among our implementation practice colleagues, and how expertise in both those technical and relational aspects is just so essential to be effectively able to do this work. So I hope that was a helpful insight into some of the work that we've been doing and that we've had the privilege to be doing in collaboration with our colleagues here in Scotland. I'm going to pass back to Sobia now, who's going to have an activity for us.
Thank you so much, Marita and Kimberly. Those were amazing, amazing descriptions of what you've been seeing in your work. And I know that we've learned so much from you. We are not going to do the activity live with us today. I'm actually going to pass this over to Allison to do a bit of a wrap up and to launch the Q&A, because I want to make sure people get their questions in. But while we're wrapping up, it'll be really helpful to hear what some of your reflections are in a Padlet. And so Vanessa is going to be posting, or she has posted, a link to the Padlet here. If you haven't used Padlet, it will take you to a different browser window. You can still listen to Zoom while you're in the Padlet. Essentially, what you can do is post on the wall some of your reflection questions or answers to these reflection questions on the screen. And with that, we'd love to hear your reflections. And you can also react to people's reflections by liking them. So while we are wrapping up, you can do that. And I'm going to hand this over now to Allison.
Oh, thanks so much, Sobia. I'm always so moved at the end of these Institute events. Every time I think that they can't get any better, and they always do, because all the people that come together for these are so amazing. I did just want to say, as well as Sylvia just said, those are incredible examples. Kim and Marita. Kim, you always remind me, of how critical reflective practice is. And I think that ISPs need to incorporate that into our own work because we are practitioners of implementation support. And I love that reminder of what we can do around that. And Marita, as you were talking through the pandemic and this focus on relational support, I was almost thinking about how this last 2+ years has almost in some ways really highlighted the role of the ISP because we've had to do so many new types of things, and I think our focus on relationships and on creativity and all of the things that make ISPs incredibly special professionals, just like you unearthed all that in that presentation, and it was just so beautifully done, both of you. Thank you so much. If all of the presenters want to turn their videos on, I thought this could be a good time as part of our wrap up. We've had so much action in the chat. So much of it has been so affirming, and we are so humbled and just grateful to have you here with us. But this is a great opportunity if anyone wants to make an additional comment or ask a specific question to any of us. We still have about 5 or 7 minutes left, and we're very, very happy to answer any questions or just kind of hear from folks. So definitely keep adding to the chat as we move through it. And, as that happens, I also wondered if any of I'll be monitoring the chat, if any of the presenters want to add a final reflection, having listened all to each other. It's been an amazing journey, even though we all knew what the slides said. It's still such a beautiful thing when the whole comes together. So we're just getting a lot of kudos in the chat, but if any questions pop up, I'll ask them. But do you all want to have any kind of final reflections just off the cuff now for us?
I just want to highlight some of the reflections that people are posting in the Padlet. I have it up on another screen and there's a lot of movement happening, but definitely people saying things like, we're not alone in this work, and feeling like they're not alone in the work. And I think that's so important to not feel alone, and that we're not isolated, and that we should connect with one another. And so I love the kinds of things that people are putting as their like aha moments in the Padlet. It's pretty amazing to see.
Oh, that's so amazing, Sobia. And we have a question in the chat. What challenges have you encountered breaking down the notion that implementation is a science and not a press button? And so I know that we've heard that, and I think in some ways we've talked about how that can contribute to burnout. This idea of folks maybe not feeling prepared for what it really takes to move forward, and the type of support that everyone needs to make it through an implementation effort. So does anyone else want to comment on that in terms of breaking down the notion that this isn't just kind of press the button and implementation happens? Rita or Kim, do you want to chime in? I think both of you all talked about that.
I think the comment I'll make is that I've seen people pick up the language of implementation science and use it as almost as another technical strategy, to think that to not appreciate what I heard someone say in the chat way back, the real work in the weeds and the time and effort that it's required. That's just not a helpful, thing to think about. Like it becomes a hammer instead of a tool, a practice tool in that case. And so, I think that we've got to keep articulating this is what it takes. And these are all the components of it to those who are, are beginning to get a familiarity with the work and maybe still have, are a little bit too distant from it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is
I
Julia.
agree, Kimberly. Sorry, I was just going to say that, and it's not a sharing that information once. It's sort of sending that message, you know, on multiple
Over and over,
times,
right.
and, you know, and really, you know, working with colleagues on the ground and advocating around that, because they're aware of how complex it is and other people aren't hearing it, or there's new people come into the system, and so, you know, it's a message that needs to be highlighted regularly, so that people understand the complexity that's involved in the work.
Absolutely. Julia?
Yeah, I was just going to share. I also think that it sounds a little bit meta, but we like to think about how you can use the same kinds of approaches we use to implement a thing, right? A change initiative, to actually get people to adopt the implementation science in how they do things. So like, what are the barriers and facilitators people are experiencing to adopting implementation science? And thinking through all of those different steps to pick strategies. Because just like we know that just teaching people or telling them this is the right thing to do is not likely to change behavior, that is also true when we're thinking about getting people to adopt a more rigorous way to implement, and especially to support implementation. And so we kind of use the same processes at multiple different levels in the system.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julia. Sobia, in these final couple minutes, anything else popping into that Padlet?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like specific things that people are taking away. They love the information on relationships, and also the idea that we need to form relationships and implementation and really focus on those. Some of the stuff related specifically to burnout, there's one, the idea of moving from what if to even if, I think resonated with a lot of people.
Me too.
Yeah, that mindset shift, which is great. Like, I love these reflections and I love that people are reacting to them. So that one had a lot of reactions to it. The energy map was important to a lot of people. And just thinking about the way that they approach their work and understanding like why they feel that way. And defining opportunity, failure as opportunity, something you said, Allison, people, that really resonated with people as well.
That's awesome. Well, you know, I also want folks to know that Todd has put into the chat an evaluation, and he keeps putting it in there for us every few times. So we do use all the evaluations we get from these events. And so please complete that, and we will take a look at that. And I think one of the things we want to leave you with today is that we see you, we understand what the role of the ISP is. We are all ISPs that are doing this event today. So it really meant a lot to us to talk about this, especially after the last, again, 2+ years, and just thinking a lot about our work and really highlighting the role of the ISP in the field of implementation science. And all it takes to do this work, and the level of skill we bring to the work, and how much we have to offer for really contributing to the ongoing building of the field of implementation science. And so you are all so deeply respected and admired for the work that you do every day to improve the lives of the populations that you're working with and the communities that you're working in. So we have deep gratitude for your time today, but also for the work that you do. And we're so happy that you got something out of this today, because it was a lot to give 2 hours of your time. I want to thank our presenters again, Kimberly Mann, Marita Brack, Julia Moore, Sobia Khan, Leah Bartley. You guys were all absolutely so amazing. We're again very grateful to the Center for Implementation for partnering with us and co-sponsoring this event. And yes, recordings will be available. We're always very quick to get things posted, so everyone will have access. And so thank you all so much. 1 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to let you all go. But thank you so much. And fill out your evaluations.